And he actually likes to have things interactive. So you don't have to wait till he's at the end of a slide or something. You can either jot your question in the message in the chat, or raise your hand, or just say, excuse me, speak up. We're a small enough group that we do want to hear your voices, so we don't have to, we're not as concerned as if there were 30 of us. And it is being recorded. Thank you, Nathan, so that you can watch it again, because I know, Tucker, you're one of the people who said, is this being recorded? I want to watch this again. And of course, Marcy, will get this out to you and to the other coaches so that you can make sure that your other students have a chance to watch this. So with that, Tom, thank you for being on board with us. We're excited to hear about your experience and expertise, what you're doing, where you've been, what you're doing, and what your vision is for the future.
My vision for the future. Love that. Well, my name is Tom Hall, and currently I am the forest supervisor on the Superior National Forest within the Forest Service in the Department of Agriculture within the U.S. government. I actually live in Cloquet, Minnesota. I've been in this position for about 3.5 years. I have about 20 years with the Forest Service, and sort of leading, let's start from the beginning and sort of work up. I actually grew up in the Forest Service. My dad actually worked for the Forest Service. It's the family business. My brother works for the Forest Service as well. But we grew up in the mountains in Colorado, south central Colorado, and surrounding the valley, the San Luis Valley, is the Rio Grande National Forest. So really, I grew up in the forest as I was little, all the way through my schooling. My first job was actually out of high school, was with the Forest Service as a temporary seasonal employee. And that sort of led me down the path of, I want to go to school for this. So I actually went to the University of Colorado State University in Fort Collins, Colorado. And I got a bachelor's and a master's in forestry, both with a fire science concentration. I actually worked for the Colorado State Forest Service as a forester, helping private landowners write management plans for their lands, trying to help conserve forested lands throughout Colorado, and then do reforestation as well. So building or putting in windbreaks and other things, especially along the plains. There's really windy in Colorado there. Somewhere during that time, I was actually in the Colorado Army National Guard. I was a helicopter mechanic, and that helped me to pay for school. But once I graduated, I got into a special hiring authority with the Forest Service, since I had a master's degree that allowed me to sort of come into the agency at a higher level. And so really appreciative of that. It was sort of written in the stars that I was going to be moving in that direction anyways, just for that long connection that I had to the Forest Service. So I have worked in Colorado. I've worked in California, both Southern California and Northern California. And then I worked in Washington, D.C. With the Forest Service. And then from Washington, D.C., I actually came to Northern Minnesota and the Superior National Forest. So the Superior National Forest is actually one of the larger national forests within the National Forest System. It's 3.2 million acres of mostly contiguous land there in northern Minnesota, as all of you probably know. Most of the Forest Service lands actually exist out in the western part of the country, much larger not larger forests, but much larger tracts of forests that are put together that are sort of in the public domain. So a lot of these lands were not homesteaded. And so as they were sort of left over, and there's complicated history with that, all lands being, native lands that, white people have had treaties with and broken treaties. But realistically, from how we think of private land ownership underneath our Constitution and how we operate underneath our government, these lands were not owned by anybody. And so they came into the public domain. And so the Western United States, nobody had claimed those. A lot of the Eastern United States, we've actually acquired lands to bring into the national forest system. And so there's actually a lot of forests in the East, but they're a lot more segmented, a lot more checkerboard, as we say. So when you think of township and range sections, those are sort of chunked up as they were doing surveys throughout the West. There are different ways of dividing land, metes and bounds in some parts of the United States, including parts of the eastern seaboard and in Texas. And so it's a little bit different, but there are also lands in a lot of the eastern United States as well. I'm going to bring up my presentation, very short, but just to sort of think about some of the things that I think related to forestry. Can you see that?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So just thinking of forestry in general, right? What is forestry in the broad sense? I think a lot of the research material that was presented to you, the website that Cheryl was able to share with me, very engaging, very interesting material. Happy to sort of talk through the questions that you have from your research. And if, you know, my conversation sort of stimulates that, it's a broad topic, right? And really forestry, at least in the modern era, is really about ecosystems, right? It's about how do systems work together and what is that long-term need, knowing that humans are on the landscape, right? If we left ecosystems unto themselves, they would take care of themselves, right? You think of insect and disease, you think of fires. Most of the ecosystems that we live within, that we interact with as humans, exist perfectly fine without humans, probably better than if humans weren't here, right? But that is not really something that we can entertain, right? And so we have interrupted those disturbance cycles of insect and disease. We've interrupted those disturbance cycles of forest, of fire. And there's actually products that are useful for our use as humans, whether that's lumber for building materials. There's many different things. We actually have a forest products laboratory that's a part of the Forest Service that helps to develop new and interesting, useful products that we can use wood for, or other types of wood products. And that is useful information for timber industry. So there's economic drivers to how we manage forests throughout the country and throughout the world. And then there are other things that we are trying to take the place of those disturbances. So if we have interrupted those disturbance cycles of fire or insect and disease, sometimes we use forestry as a tool to manage trees so that we try to replicate those healthy ecosystems. So the Forest Service is, at least at a national level, you know, there's multiple levels of government, right? The national level, the federal government, we are the forestry sort of experts within our field. We actually have multiple different disciplines. We actually have research and development as a part of what we do. But really how we manage forests, our national forest system lands, the Superior National Forest being one of those, 3.2 million acres in northern Minnesota. I think there's 164 national forests. You'd have to do your research and actually quote how many there are from that, but I believe there's 164 forest supervisors throughout the country. Again, most of those exist in the Western United States. But we also work with state, private, and tribal lands and the management of forestry on those lands to help them to keep lands forested, to have those positive effects on the landscape and utilize trees for whatever purposes they've identified for themselves. Obviously, states and counties typically use timbered lands for income revenue. A lot of the school sections that were set aside for those revenues that go into schools actually are timbered lands. And so they manage those lands for income revenue generation. We also have an international forestry branch within the Forest Service that helps other countries with the research that we have to, stop illegal logging, stop unsafe or unwise practices, deforestation in tropical environments, those sorts of things, knowing that there's other drivers a lot of times for how those forested lands exist and whether those are of the best purpose for those humans at that time, trying to conserve those lands long term. We try to provide those things that we've learned sometimes through the School of Hard Knocks. So a lot of the things that we do are around ecosystem health, whether that's insect and disease, or air or water or habitat, all of those things of what we need healthy ecosystems for. We also manage for timber production. So there's some lands, and we actually have a forest plan that identifies some lands are better for timber production, and some lands are better for forest health, and some lands are for wilderness, and some lands are for recreation. And that's similar to any sort of zoning within local municipalities. We set aside a plan for how we're going to manage those lands over a set period of time. So timber production is one of those. Risk reduction. So we have a lot of lands where people live nearby. This last year, we actually had really intense fires in northern Minnesota, the Camp House and Jenkins Creek fires. They made the news. But you think of the fires from Canada and the smoke that we all got to eat over the last couple of years, the ones in California that seem perpetual and burn down communities and threaten all the things that we love about forested ecosystems. So thinking about, what is climate change and what are those risks of those disturbances potentially exacerbated, right? Being fire or insect and disease, all of those sorts of things. There's a risk. Again, humans living in or within these environments introduces risk that we have to manage. And so we have firefighters and we do fuels reduction as part of our forestry techniques. And then obviously reforestation. So those fires that burned last year, we are planting a bunch of baby trees this year to make sure that those lands maintain their forested characteristics. And we do that even when there aren't fires, when we do timber production techniques, silviculture techniques to reduce fuels or to have that timber production, we come back in and replant. Sometimes changing what that stand dynamic looks like, and sometimes just perpetuating what was there before, depending on what that plan was for those lands. And then obviously there's a recreation component to what we do. We all love to experience forested environments. As humans, we have a spiritual connection to being outside and being in forested environments. And so there's an element to what we do related to forestry for managing for that. So somewhat related to that is, these are pictures of all those things that I sort of just talked through, whether it's managing fire, using prescribed fire, suppressing fire, timber production, reforestation, recreation, insect and disease, or just that ecosystem management. These are all examples of what that looks like throughout the country. I think that's all I have from a presentation standpoint. I can definitely bring this up again if people want to, but I would definitely appreciate engagement and questions if you have it.
Well, I have a question. So I'm wondering, since you've had some diverse experience in different parts of the country, what about the job remains consistent and what changes based on the location or the environment?
Yeah, so the species composition in every location is slightly different, right? Each of those ecosystems, whether it's based on the soil type or the climate, the weather that we experience, and those disturbance cycles, those are all slightly different, right? Obviously, where we work within the Forest Service is forested predominantly. We definitely have some forests that are more grasslands and some that are desert environments. But there are other land management agencies that manage a lot of those lands instead of the Forest Service. So we have a very small proportion of that. Um, I think how we approach what we do is very consistent, right? There's a science to forestry. There's things that we learn from the research and development that we do, that universities do, that help us to be consistent, to think of how do we approach that, and then how we try to engage with people, right? Although each individual is different, right? And each person that works for the Forest Service is different. There's a consistency to what is needed to engage with people because, again, these ecosystems would function perfectly fine without humans involved with them. But that is not the reality of what we live in. And so trying to make sure that people understand the places that they live or the places that they care about, and making sure that we're engaging with them is a pretty consistent thing that we do.
It sounds like you're kind of the mediator between the forest environment and human environment.
Definitely in my role, as you get further down, you may not like to interact with people as much. Foresters are kind of notorious for liking to be out in the forest and not engaging with people. They might like trees more than they like people. Obviously, I've progressed in my career. I have an ability to talk to people. And so some people promote up as well.
And we appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you guys, so it sounds like management of the forest is kind of maintaining the forest. Do you see taking a more active role with changes related to climate change or helping the forest adapt to that change?
Yeah, so the Superior National Forest has actually been pretty innovative. We have an assisted migration plan, knowing that there is climate change that is impacting these ecosystems, right? And so the research that has been done around that has sort of indicated, some species are going to be winners in the environment as climate change occurs, and some species are going to be losers in those environments. And so knowing that the ecosystems are going to change. Those are natural cycles. We have sped up those cycles, potentially with climate change, right? We want to keep these ecosystems forested. And so we've sort of built and worked with tribes and worked with the public around a plan of what are those species that we can be pretty confident that they're going to be winners in that climate change environment, and make sure that we're keeping those ecosystems healthy. Maybe we bring in species diversity, maybe we bring in climate diversity within those genomes. So it may be the same species, but we're looking for seed stock that is further south in Minnesota, so that they're used to warmer climates. But it's still the same species, right? But the genetics are slightly different. And so we've thought through those things, trying to maintain those forested ecosystems that we have.
And
There are places
are
in
you,
the country
yeah,
that are going to be drastically different. And you see that in California, where you're really going through sort of a type conversion from forested ecosystems into brush. And really, there's probably not very much that we can do in those sorts of ecosystems that are on the further extreme. Fire is going to type convert those lands, and we're going to manage those in a different way over time.
so those are things you're implementing already as
Yep.
far, yep.
Yeah, so trying to be proactive where we can. Unfortunately, sometimes we can only be reactive, and a lot of that is based on time and money, right? We are beholden to Congress and budgets, and so
Mhm.
that's just the reality of how we manage through that. So with limited time and limited money and lots of work, you prioritize the places that you work and the things that you're able to do.
Yeah, go
Oh,
ahead, Owen.
I was just gonna ask, how have things changed, like strategy wise and technology wise, since you first started out?
yeah, so technology has actually been a huge change, really over a very short amount of time, right? The 20 years that I've been working for the Forest Service, we used to go out with our notepads and, do our stand exams on a stand. You'd go out and use your clinometer and your other silviculture sort of tools to understand, how tall trees are, and your prism to understand how much basal area you have out on a landscape. And realistically, now we do that all on a tablet, right? And we use Survey 123 to record that, and you come back into the office and it downloads into ArcGIS online, and these things are all connected, and you start to build that plan in a different way. I think the general techniques are still the same. It still takes people going out onto the landscape to understand what those stands look like. And then you have to build those plans. But the tools, and you think of that metadata that we have, the big problems that we're able to sort of analyze with the data that we do have, there's more techniques that we can apply, but the fundamentals of the techniques of forestry don't really change.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Tucker, you have a question too?
Yeah, me and my dad were just wondering about like what you're doing, like if you are doing anything with like wildlife overpasses or corridors or just generally like migrational and like genetic diversity aids. Um yeah.
We definitely think about that. We generally manage habitat. There's authorities that we have. The state is tasked with managing species, right? And so we work really closely with the Minnesota DNR in their management of species and our management of habitat on National Forest System lands to understand, where those corridors are needed, what size habitats are needed. So we think, especially of threatened and endangered species, are sort of dominant in how we mitigate some of those impacts, right? And so lynx is a big driver, especially in our part of the world in northern Minnesota. And thinking of those large land tracts, what road impacts have, and it's not always interstates, right? It's those little access roads that go to everybody's cabins out on the landscape, right? The highways that connect into that. And so that fragmentation of land is a really big impact to habitat for most species, right? There are some species, you think of mountain lions or others, that actually take advantage of those fragmented landscapes and can impact prey species and decimate prey species because of that fragmentation of landscapes. But thinking of snowshoe hare and thinking of lynx, they need bigger tracts of land that have less disturbance. Well, not less disturbance, but less fragmentation. And so those roads are a really big deal in that. When I think of overpasses or underpasses for wildlife, a lot of the time that's really driven by that human interaction with wildlife, right? It's because of those car accidents that we have with hitting wildlife. Most big game crossing a road is not that big of a deal. It's how we manage along the road, right? There's kind of an attractant for deer because it's fresh grass. There's salt after the winter that they're attracted to, right? And so that attractive nuisance that then we hit, we have to mitigate that with, deer fences or elk fences where I grew up in Colorado. and underpasses and overpasses. That does help. Those are definitely techniques that we've developed that are helpful for those types of species for sure.
Yeah, thanks. That cleared up my question.
Awesome.
So what do you see happening here now in Voyager with this ban having been lifted for mining?
So the Rainy River mineral withdrawal. Yeah. So realistically, there are many things that sort of still have to occur related to that. You know, most of what we do with the Forest Service is we manage that surface, that federal surface that is a part of National Forest System lands. We also work with the Bureau of Land Management. So from a federal government standpoint, they are tasked with managing the mineral estate. And so that includes copper nickel in the case of the Superior National Forest. There's also helium and hydrogen that have been discovered at high quantities. And so there is private interest in that development, right? There's economic interest in those development, both copper nickel and helium and hydrogen. And so, next steps are really leasing and then some sort of plan of operation if those leases are allowed, right? Depending on where that occurs and what those mitigations are. And so from a federal standpoint, there's a process, right? And within our government process, there is a legal challenge to all things that are possible as well. And so fully anticipate that there will be many legal challenges to all of the different steps that may occur. Somewhat aside from that, because the Congressional Review Act was used on removing the mineral withdrawal, really that can never be put in place in a similar way because of that act. And so really we'll never see that again unless Congress passes a mineral withdrawal for this area or it's designated as wilderness.
And so as you're saying, then part of the plan, I think it was implied that part of the plan that they have to propose is the restoration.
Sorry, say that again.
So will you mention a plan when they have their plan, if there is any mining or anything like that, part of that plan has to be clearly the restoration process too.
Yeah. So depending on what sort of mineral development there is, right? There is always a restoration reclamation process, right? Many open pit mines, there's not much restoration that can be done. It's reclamation, right? Can it be utilized or returned to a usable place? Previous iterations of the Twin Metal mine plan of operation was actually an underground mine. So there's, depending on where that entrance tunnel is, there may be somewhat small level of reclamation, restoration. But really the tailing piles where they're pulling that unusable material that still has sulfur bearing material to it, that's probably the biggest concern. So where that exists is a big part of however that progresses.
So where is that? I mean, is that like in the boundary waters and the waters areas or on the edges? What does that look like in terms of going up there and all those wonderful hiking trails?
Yeah, so the boundary waters is minerally withdrawn because it is a wilderness area. So it will never have mining inside of it. There's also a mining exclusion zone around that federally and from the state perspective. And so there is a buffer around most of that. And so this is outside of both of those things. There are federal and private mineral rights that exist. And so it is in that watershed, so it's really interesting sort of hydrology. Water goes in three directions on the Superior National Forest. What we're talking about is it loops and goes north into the Hudson Bay. And there's a part that goes east into Lake Superior, into the Atlantic, and then there's a part that goes south into the Mississippi, the headwaters of the Mississippi River to the south.
I don't want to consume this time. So anybody else has questions, please speak up because I have tons of questions.
There,
Um,
there was a lot of questions in the material about loss of forest area causing desertification or changes to make the land into deserts, basically by losing topsoil. Have you have you guys had a lot of issues with that? Is that something that's a big
Yeah.
concern?
We haven't. Historically, those are definitely issues within the United States. You think of like tropical environments and that type conversion that is occurring within tropical rainforest into grazing land. A lot of times that's what's actually referenced. Very rarely is it actually truly desert. It kind of depends on that climate, that environment that it exists within. When you think of like California and that type conversion that is occurring from forested ecosystems into brush ecosystems, chaparral, those sorts of, they are natural ecosystems that exist in that Mediterranean climate. And so you could think of those as desertification of that. It's not truly by definition that, but that type conversion, right? Those are concerning, and especially for how we experience that as humans, right? There is an impact, especially when you get into those tropical environments, when we're type converting from tropical rainforest into grazing land. There's so many things that we just don't know of what it could be impacting, but you know, those benefits that we already know do exist. Whether that's carbon sequestration or you know production of oxygen and all of the things that you get as benefits from trees, you have less than that because grass does not perform in that same way, and you're raising cattle on that produce methane and other things as part of their digestion.
So, as a follow up question, out west where they have a lot of grazing, has that changed what the forest ecosystem is like in those areas that were grazed?
Not typically. You know, probably the biggest impact is actually to riparian areas, and there's a lot of management around rangeland use in forested ecosystems or even, you know, grassland ecosystems of trying to protect riparian ecosystems. A lot of those have very unique tree species within riparians, even in northern Minnesota, anywhere in the country, right? We can recognize that there's a change in the tree species and the brush species that exist in when you get near water, right? And especially moving streams or rivers. And so, you know, that's the biggest impact is, you know, especially when you get a bunch of cattle that move into water, right? They're attracted to water, they need to drink, they need to do those sorts of things. They start to impact those banks, those intake go down into those riparian areas, and that water quality is impacted as well. And so there's a lot of management to manage that, to exclude that where possible.
Okay.
But it really doesn't change the ecosystem per se.
Okay.
I actually had two questions for you. The first of which is, are there any like special considerations that you're doing for like old growth forests and like preserving those?
Yeah, so those forest plans that we have are a really big part of, you know, what we protect and why we protect that. And so some parts of the country, old growth is a lot more special, a lot more unique, and potentially a lot more fragile and vulnerable to disturbance, to human impacts, right? And so, you know, there's kind of a plus minus cost benefit analysis that we do sometimes. When you exclude disturbance in disturbance ecosystems where old growth exists, right? Whether that's northern Minnesota or northern California, where there's redwoods and sequoias, you know, any ecosystem, you know, the mountains in Colorado where you have limber pine that is at the high elevations, right? There's old growth. It's not always the largest trees, but they've been there a really long time. And sometimes they are the largest trees. But in disturbance ecosystems, those old trees are actually used to seeing some level of disturbance over time, right? Whether that's fire or insect and disease, or other types of disturbance that can be wind and water and other types of things. So when we exclude that through what we think are best of intention, sometimes that makes that more explosive, right? And we've seen that a lot with fire suppression. We were really good at fire suppression across the country for the last 100 years. And that has actually made it that much worse because we have not replaced that with an effective alternative, right? And so these fire adapted ecosystems, especially as you see climate change, where it's better environment for fire to occur, right, is going to be more destructive. And so there's a balance with that. When we think of old growth in the Forest Service, right, we may design a part of our forest to say, hey, we recognize there's old growth out on this landscape and we want to maintain that. And there's lots of nuance to how do you do that? How do you help to preserve that, knowing that it may require some disturbance, but it also takes some protection.
Thanks, that was really informative. And also, I have another question because I know Owen and Marcy both know we recently had a practice problem about kind of that like insects and disease thing where it was about like this uh disease that was spreading all throughout the forests, and I was just wondering if you have any specific information on like more about that.
Yeah, so there's all sorts of different insects and diseases that are both endemic and invasive, right? So an endemic species, so in northern Minnesota right now we have spruce bloodworm that is kind of at an epidemic proportion. But realistically, it's a natural disturbance within that ecosystem. Spruce bloodworm actually exists there all the time, right? We also have tent caterpillar that exists there all the time. And there's a little bit of an alternating cycle that we have in boreal ecosystems. So the Superior National Forest is at the southern tip of the boreal ecosystem. Most of that exists up in Canada. And so you can see that both in Canada and in northern Minnesota, that we have these cycles of spruce bloodworm. And then alternatively, when that is not occurring, you potentially have these impacts of tent caterpillars. And so those can be really large disturbance areas. Again, these ecosystems have adapted to that occurring on a regular basis. When fire does not occur, these other types of insect and diseases do occur. But we also see that there's invasive species that can exist. And so we see that with emerald ash borer. And really ash has been almost decimated, right? It is sort of moving across the country. American chestnut, that has also been deeply impacted by invasive species from other countries. There's not an effective resistance to that when that is introduced into a new environment. And so when you think of Customs and Border Patrol saying, hey, you can't bring plants or you can't bring things in from other countries, there's actually a big reason because they don't want those invasives that our ecosystems aren't adapted to, because they can be really destructive. And so, out west, mountain pine beetle or Ips beetle, there's a lot of endemic insect and disease, and there's invasive insect and disease as well.
Do you feel like some of those insects have been altered enough by climate change to make them bigger, having more of an impact than they would have had in a natural cycle?
They can be. It's interesting with climate change. The extremes are amplified, right? We have higher highs and lower lows and wetter wets and drier dries, right? And you see that throughout the country, right? And so right now we're sort of in an El Nino cycle, and some parts of the country are going to be really, really dry. Some parts of the country are going to be really, really wet. And so you sort of see that. Even for us on the Superior National Forest, last year was really dry, right? And the year before that, we were really wet. We had a bunch of flooding that blew out a bunch of roads. And, 1 year to the next, right? It's not really smooth cycles anymore. There's always been cycles like highs and lows, right? And all of those sort of dynamics. But it's more extreme now, right? Up and down, it's not sort of a smooth cycle. And so we still get really cold, which is a big part. You think of like moose habitat and moose health, right? Ticks are a really, really big problem for moose.
Yeah.
And because we're not getting those really deep cold, really the biggest impact in Minnesota is the winters are getting warmer than any other part of the year, right? And so you think of that for mountain pine beetle, you think of that for spruce budworm, you think of that for ticks, right? Those endemic species, when there's a warmer winter or those sorts of things, they can definitely take advantage of those opportunities for sure.
Do you think there may be a role in the future of using genetically modified species that are more resistant to these type of organisms?
All things are possible, right? We've definitely seen that with chestnut, right? Of trying to introduce, resistant, strange genetics into that reforestation program. White pine, blister rust, that's a really big issue that was almost wiped out. And so, there's a lot of research that's gone into trying to plant blister rust resistant white pines throughout the country, and it's actually been really effective. And so that's been an ongoing cycle of forestry management to use genetics to the benefit. Genetic modification can get sort of a bad rap, especially when you think of that with agriculture, but there are definitely aspects of that that are applied to forestry, not really at the same extreme, but are beneficial to maintaining forested ecosystems.
Marcy, you mentioned the like genetic modification too, but some of the things I'm sure you've seen, Tom and Marcy, you get out a lot too. You love to get out in nature and hike, and how some of these invasive species, that was the first topic of the year that Tucker was talking about there, how they have modified to live in a climate that wasn't necessarily where they were. And this barberry has like taken over our woods.
Yeah.
And it's
I mean,
horrible. It's just horrible
natural
stuff.
natural selection will take its own course, right? And the greatest adapted species will prevail. Some of those, you think of insects, some of those reproduction cycles occur twice in a year, some even more than that. Typically, we don't see disturbance within forestry for those insect and disease that are more than twice a year. At least in the United States, once a year is more typical. And so those cycles of natural selection, right, are playing out on an ongoing basis, right? When they get into that epidemic proportion, those genetics of reproduction are playing out, and those winners are winning and the losers are losing. And you get to play the numbers a lot more when you're not at an endemic, but an epidemic sort of proportion. And so they start to take advantage, and those genetics will play out for sure.
So you mentioned too the warmer winters, and so we had this heat and all these storms in April. It was just crazy, 80 degrees. We had 88 for 2 days in a row, and it created all these
in northern Minnesota.
Yeah, and it's like, so people saying, and of course then we had the gnats. There was this huge gnat hatch, and people were like, well, why is that? And I said, we didn't have a cold enough winter. I want you to tell them that, Tom, because I said, you can't celebrate a warm winter and then complain about the gnats. That isn't how it is in Minnesota. We need those long stretches of sustained cold.
Yeah. Well, realistically, those climates that are just to the south of us, we are experiencing what they experience, right? And so those insects, those wonderful recreation opportunity days, and those insects that they experience are traveling north.
Well, and I even look at you up north, there's a ton of water right now. The waterfalls are crazy. Down here where I live down in Brainerd, we are way dry. Like the lake is way down, and that's That's only like a couple 100 miles. Like, it's not that far.
Yeah, there's microclimates everywhere, right? And as climate change it continues to progress, right? What those look like in those microclimates are going to be different, right? You can't think of Minnesota as one sort of area, right? You can't think of the Midwest as one area. Like each of these are going to play out in different ways for sure.
So you work with forests, so I don't know if you're aware the same way, because for us living on the Mississippi, forests, we have bluffs full of forests. My husband and I are blessed to own a lot of acreage, and on top of the bluff, we look out over the Mississippi. But in a lot of the backwaters, the last couple of years, so many of those trees in those backwaters and on those islands, they're just dead.
Yeah.
What's that about? What's going on with that?
So I don't know specifically. Drought can be a big factor in that, right? You think of what that water table is, even along the Mississippi, right? That, a lot of times there's sort of that floodplain, right? And how far that water table goes out into that landscape, right, is a real big factor in what vegetation exists along any sort of riparian area. And as you have droughts, right, that water table recedes into that water channel and potentially even gets smaller in that water channel, right? As Marcy was saying, even with the lake, right? And so those are dynamics, right? If there's a long enough time period that those roots from those trees cannot reach that consistent water, then there's going to be a large impact to that. That's probably the place that I would start with that. It depends what those species are. If they're getting impacted by a specific insect and disease, obviously emerald ash borer is a huge factor that is just coming into Minnesota and having a really big impact if those are ash trees.
A lot of these are, no, I can't say it. Well, they're willows and
Sure. Very,
those.
very water dependent species. And so most likely it's drought and some sort of water table change.
Okay. Because it's one thing to see the forest, but for us, everything's a forest. Whether it's because, like I said, we go to the top of our hill and we see all these islands, and people don't realize, if you can't get up and see it like we do, they don't realize how wide it is here and how many backwaters there are, and determining what's the main channel. It's a big deal.
Humans need natural environments, right? That's why we have parks in cities, and that's why those urban forests are really important elements of any sort of human environment. And so yeah, it's important no matter where you are.
Okay, well, we're nearing the end of the hour. I don't want to cut anybody off, but any last questions, thoughts, ideas? Sometimes our students like to throw out a possible solution and have you respond to it. Yep, Owen's got his hand up.
I was just gonna ask, like, what are your thoughts on, you just brought this up now, and I was curious, what are your thoughts on like urban forest management and how that's different than
Yeah, so there's definitely different
natural
techniques to what urban forestry is and how you do that, right? Some of these trees are overloved, right? The number of people that are going to touch that tree, that are going to experience that, and that are going to really care about what is going to happen to that tree. It takes a lot more what I call tender loving care, right? And so you have arborists that are foresters, right? But are a lot more in tune with how humans experience those natural environments within cities, right? Those urban sort of forests, especially parks, right? When you get into urban forestry along river corridors or other sorts of things, you might have a little bit more of a natural environment, but there's still a lot of human experience of that. And so it's a special certification to have an arborist that is focused on, sort of those human experienced trees. we have foresters that work in the Forest Service. We have silviculturists and we have foresters, and they all have forestry degrees, and they probably wouldn't do quite as well as an arborist would in a city environment. But they all had the same technical schooling.
So would that be a similar degree or would it be different?
Yeah, so we would all start out in the same spot, right? We would all get a forestry degree, and then you progress in your career and you get special certifications and you focus areas and those sorts of things. And so that's what an arborist is they go down a path and get those special sort of certification.
Do you have a special interest in forestry?
Well, as I mentioned very briefly, both of my forestry degrees actually have a fire science concentration. So I thought I was going to be a fuels planner, a firefighter in my career, and I still do work very closely with wildland fire suppression, but I have not specialized it in the same way as what my schooling was for. But it still has a very special part in my heart of what it takes to suppress fire, to manage fire, knowing that it is a natural part of the ecosystem. And really, because humans are always going to be a part of this, at least within our context, right? We need to manage that in an effective way.
It's so interesting. We were in Yellowstone shortly after they had that big fire, and I've been on the powwow trail up north after the fire there, and it's just so much different how it's regrowing and what it looks like and the rate of that. And Yellowstone, you can tell some that it was burnt, but it's not the same as the powwow trail in northern Minnesota.
Yeah, so one thing that I've noticed, again, I grew up in Colorado, I've worked in California, Minnesota is somewhat unique in that we are a water positive system. And, some of, especially the Spear National Forest, it's ledge rock, right? You're right down to the bedrock. And so once you had a disturbance, stand replacing fire, even though you're in a water positive system, right? We get regrowth that is amazing compared to out west. But there's some places that there's just no soil left. And so it takes time for rocks and organic material to break down to create soil again.
And that is the critical point, isn't it? Anytime we mess with something, it takes time. So the importance of staying on the trails when you're hiking. It's one thing, even if you picked up a piece of bark on the trail versus pulling one off the tree.
Mhm.
And I know, we've been places that you actually have to tell people to not pull off. They love to pull off that birch bark. No, don't do that.
I mean, one person's impact is relatively minor, but when you and everybody else does something similar, right, it starts to have a much larger impact. And so, that's the ethic that we try to help educate people and try to help people as they're recreating on public lands, right? That's a big part of why we have permits and want to have that touch when we issue those permits for going into the boundary waters. It is a very fragile ecosystem, right? And it's a unique way to recreate on national forest system lands, public lands, right? But the impact that you can have can be outsized sometimes.
And so that's our future, thinking about today, what we do today. And like you said, I'm just one person, but I'm not the only one.
Right. We have human nature, right? And, many people think in a very similar way as we do when we're doing things, right? And so we follow similar paths and look for similar shortcuts and want to experience things in sometimes destructive ways.
Absolutely. Well, this has been really helpful. There's been some great questions. Thank you, everyone who's asked questions. And Tom, we really appreciate you taking time to have somebody, you know, who's in the trenches and your diversity in the different parts of the country you've been in. What's your favorite place that you've been?
I don't know. There's so many unique aspects to every place that I've been. My wife is Thai, and so we go back to Thailand every other year. And so I would probably say those forested ecosystems are some of my favorite just because they are so diverse from what I experience anywhere else. And so that would probably be my favorite, but there's a special part in my heart for the San Luis Valley in Colorado, you know, Northern California in the Klamath Mountains, you know, the boundary waters in Northern Minnesota, you know, almost everywhere that I've been, there's a special place in my heart for that, for sure.
I can certainly see that. How do you pick a favorite?
Yeah,
I was going to say it's okay if you said Colorado. Well, you did throw that in the mix.
for sure.
If you wanted to do forestry in Thailand, would you have had enough general forestry education here, or is the education focused more on the United States, or?
Yeah. So a lot of what we do with international programs is help to build some of that knowledge of forestry techniques that we've learned. Obviously, when we first started in the United States, we actually brought that over from Europe, right? From Germany and some of their silvicultural practices. And so they've adapted, we've learned and grown based on research and experience. And so what we do on the Superior National Forest would probably not apply very well to those forested ecosystems in Thailand. But what we do on the El Yunque National Forest in Puerto Rico probably would be. And so we do things in the United States that are very relevant even in Thailand. So would I automatically be able to go over there and, you know, be able to practice forestry? Probably not. Like, could I get there in a relatively short amount of time? Probably.
Yeah, very interesting.
So have we encouraged anybody to go into forestry? Maybe not. It's a special area. Everybody has their special areas, and we're not trying to convince anybody to go that route. But like you
So-
said, you grew up in the woods. You have to be in the woods.
The place that hooked me was when I started fighting wildfire, right? And it turns out I'm an adrenaline junkie, and you know, there's an aspect of fighting wildfire that is a big part of that. And so, if you like being outdoors and you like doing those sorts of things, that's the place to get in. And then you're like, oh, well, I can't do this forever, and maybe I should go to school. And there's a connection with forestry, right? That was what it was for me. But whether it's recreation or wildlife, or you know, soils or engineering, you know, we do a lot of things in the Forest Service that are relevant to experiencing the natural environment.
So, parting words for us.
Yeah, so I really appreciate this program and the things that you're interested in and the competition that you're going towards. Hopefully this was helpful. You know, there is a bunch that I didn't even talk about that is around forestry and around the complicated issues that we manage related to National Forest System lands and forestry and disturbances and all of those sorts of things. And so there's a ton of research to continue to do related to that, but good luck in your competition.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, students who are here. Marcy,
Thank you.
as a coach, being
This is
here.
awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Owen, this is your last Topic Academy as a student anyway.
It is.
Yeah. So Tom, keep persisting, keep you know, being the United States Forestry Service, there are the politics and there's the laws and there's keeping up in that. And we all need to keep fighting for maintaining these things, you know, at whatever level. And like you say, it's management. And that comes at all levels. So hang in there. We need you.
Yeah. Well, Well, thank you so much for the invite. I appreciate your time this evening.
You're welcome. Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.